Okay, well thank you very much, and I appreciate the invitation to come down here and talk to you about one of my favorite topics, which is calves. But you could add heifers or forage particle size, and they're all favorite topics, but I don't do dry cows. That's one thing I stay completely away from. The basis of the things I'll try to recommend for you, and the things, what I tend to do is, my job is applied research and extension in Penn State. And what I try to do is pull together the data that's out there that's published. Sometimes it might be my data, but most often it is not. But try to put that all together, and from the standpoint of heifer management, it's basically to grow that calf from a heifer into a cow in an efficient, productive manner. But it has to have an emphasis on economics, and it has to have an emphasis on doing it in the right way from a standpoint of animal well-being. So it's a combination of those things. But I do say that there are lots of times I'll make a recommendation, and quite honestly, the biggest component of that is what's going to be the economics for this end of it. What might be a pretty heifer and a big heifer is important, and it's nice, but if it doesn't make sense for the milk production, I probably won't use it. And the same with a calf. Just because she's big and looks nice, it has to make sense in terms of the economics for that cow. So to try to cover the topics of calves, colostrum to me is number one. If you only gave me one slide, it would be something related to colostrum, but they gave me a few more than that, as you'll see. Colostrum means life or death to that calf, and the bottom line is it means economics for the farm. And there is lots and lots of data that bring it back down to an economic basis for you and I. What is colostrum? And one thing that once in a while people forget, and I'm assuming none of you fit in that category, but just once in a while someone forgets that it's not the first milking after calving. It's not the first milking after you see that she calved. It's really what's happened in that mammary gland during the dry period, and it's that first milking. And there are a percentage, as we get higher and higher milk producing cows, there are a greater percentage of them that the colostrum is somewhere in that maternity pen. And that's just life, but we can manage around that very easily. Benefits from colostrum, the number one benefit is immunoglobulins. And in my talk, I'll just say I'll have AB for antibodies, or I'll say antibodies, because I can only say the word immunoglobulins about 3 times in one talk and not get it all muddled. So that is one of the benefits, and I'll go through that. The other thing that colostrum has, though, that are extremely beneficial for a calf is it's got a fair bit of fat in it. I've seen samples as high as 40% fat. That's a real unusual one, but it's very often 3 to 5 to 7 times as much fat as what normal milk would have, and it's because that calf is born very energy deficient. It doesn't have a lot of fat when they're born, and they're going to need energy in the first few hours of life in lots of times of the year, especially where I come from, to keep themselves warm. But they need energy to just get themselves acclimated and to start maintaining their normal body functions. They need lots of other things in there, like proteins and minerals that are there. There's also a lot of other proteins. We keep learning about all the other, there's probably 200 to 300 different proteins in colostrum, and I would say I'm sure we haven't really identified all of those different proteins, but some of them have some very biologically important components for that calf in terms of development. Then when you come from the dangers in colostrum, and to me, after doing a bunch of research in it for a few years, is the number one danger of colostrum is bacteria. And that's something that we all have to be concerned about, and I'll have a few slides on that. Obviously, sometimes if you've got Johne's, mycoplasma, a few other diseases, there's a real issue of transferring diseases by way of feeding colostrum. And Once in a while it's inconvenient to collect, depending on the farm or situation. And despite the fact that I'm riding with 2 veterinarians this week, and I'm a nutritionist, I will have to concede that the disease issue is a big one. And when it comes to overall calf management, no matter what I say as a nutritionist, is if you don't have a healthy calf, all the rest of what you're doing is not going to do much. So health is got to be of primary importance, and that's not really the topic today. I'm doing much more nutrition. Okay, the issue with the cow is that the bovine species, as well as the equine and a few others, don't have the ability to transfer the maternal antibodies that cow has that's keeping her alive and healthy, and or ones that we have vaccinated her for so that she has those antibodies. She doesn't have the ability to get those across the placenta to that unborn calf. So it's so very different than humans. I mean, we're born in a nice clean hospital, and yet we really wouldn't have to be because when we were born, we had the same immunity that our mothers had 10 minutes before we were born. The cow doesn't have that. That calf is born pretty much completely devoid of any immunity, which means any disease exposure she gets from the variety of things that she can get in the maternity pen, either from the cow or the pen, she's going to be completely susceptible for until she gets colostrum. And so it's a goal of you and I to make sure that calf has the same antibodies that the cow has. I mean, obviously, if we don't do that, we've wasted our money on dry cow vaccinations or whatever vaccinations we have for that cow that might be affecting the calf. So that's the big goal. And the cow has the ability, by way of the way that she's designed, to get that to happen real fast in terms of ingesting colostrum, digesting it, and absorbing it. But the key thing to this, and then these 3 things are set up very well in nature, but there's one that precedes that. And what is that?
Gotta be born alive.
Got to be born alive, but you have to intercede to get that system to process, to go through, before that calf can get colostrum in a reasonable manner. Now, I know those beef cows that are out there are all getting colostrum, and you don't have to intercede with that. But in the Holstein cow, assuming most of you have Holsteins, if not all, there's some issues there that calf is born and its head is up about this high and the teats are down about this high, and you've got a calf that isn't necessarily strong enough to stand up and nurse. And the whole concept of management today is we have to start off that process and get that to work. The calf is designed really well in that it's got a 4-part stomach that it's going to use a whole lot later on, but early on that abomasum is the only part that's functioning. And so she's designed so that when we get colostrum and the head does not have to be up, it could be down. It looks normal with the picture this way, but that colostrum goes down her esophagus and then continues on to something that we call an esophageal groove to bypass the rumen and get right in the abomasum where it's going to be digested. And this is what it looks like this is about a 1-month-old or maybe 6-week-old calf, where we've got the esophagus is coming in here into the reticulum part, going down through here to where it's going to go into the omasum and the abomasum. And these are real muscular folds that actually do close with the stimulus and sights and sounds and smells of this colostrum, closes and allows that colostrum to go right where it should be. One of the reasons I always like to show this slide, though, is that I'm going to tell you that a good way of feeding, if you aren't already doing it, is an esophageal feeder. And when you use an esophageal feeder, you get it down to here, and I can guarantee nobody is ever going to get it in here. So that colostrum will end up here. But the good news is there's lots of data showing that colostrum or any liquid feed is going to pass from here out through here in just a matter of minutes, in a very few minutes too. So the impact of using an esophageal feeder on the level of immunity that you get in that calf is zero. I didn't have any data to show you on that, but there is no impact of that. I can let that calf suckle, or I can use an esophageal feeder, and in an hour later I'm going to have the same blood levels of IgGs, and that follows all the way through. Okay, the second component of digesting colostrum is getting milk to get the right part of that colostrum into the small intestine for absorption. And the calf has one main enzyme that's functioning very well at birth. A lot of the other digestive enzymes aren't functioning to peak capacity, at least at birth, but there's one called renin. And renin is a specific enzyme that takes milk protein, and it only works with casein, and milk fat, and forms a curd. So the calf is the original cheese maker of the world. They make cheese in their stomach and their abomasum, and they do it really fast. This slide says 3 to 6 minutes, but if you get both of those, if you get that at body temperature, it happens within a minute. You get that good curd formation. And the curd contains all the casein and the milk fat, and that's going to stay in the abomasum. The whey is got milk sugar in it, lots of different proteins, except for casein, and minerals and vitamins, and basically all the other stuff that's in colostrum, all those growth factors and all those other things that may be there. And it's going to get shunted off in the small intestine. And one of the key proteins that are in there that's important is those immunoglobulins, or the antibodies. So when I give that calf, I'm giving it 4 liters of colostrum, 4 quarts of colostrum. Sorry, I talk in metric once in a while. That 4 quarts of colostrum is not really going to fit in that abomasum. And I always get questions about that. The abomasum, boy, it isn't even that big. I'm making it, it's a bit smaller. It can stretch some. But what happens when you feed that 4 quarts is by the time you're on quart number 3, quart number 1 has been made into cheese, and the whey is being shunted off in the small intestine. So the amount of the curd that forms from that 4 quarts of colostrum will fit in that abomasum pretty well. But you can't put the whole amount in there. And I know that's always a question. And although I can't put my finger on this, I've never seen anyone recommend more than 4 quarts of colostrum, and I think there's an upper limit there, and it's probably about 4 quarts. But I've honestly never looked for that data. Someone asked me about that yesterday, and I think 4 quarts is about the right place. Every once in a while, when I teach some in a dairy management class, and I'll have all the students take a colostrum sample, measure it 2 or 3 different ways, like I'm hoping you're doing, and then do a few calculations based on the body size of the calf, and are they getting adequate amounts of immunoglobulins into that calf. And every year I will use a colostrum. I'll mix up some 2nd and 3rd milking, or once in a while I'll even go to extremes and bring a gallon of milk, whole milk with me, and pour some in and make sure it's a good 2nd or 3rd milking. And last year I had one that the student did the calculation that, because no matter how low you get it, you could get enough IgGs from it if it had any. And they calculated, and that calf would have to get 17 quarts of colostrum in the first feeding, and it would have adequate immunity. And by rotating the students, I had 2 students that ended up with that same colostrum. One of them was obviously from a dairy farm, and they said, yes, it's 17 quarts, but I don't think this is going to work. And the other was obviously not from a dairy farm and was pretty adamant that you feed 17 quarts. But there is an upper limit there. So this curd formation, this is one that is sometimes not well understood, but it's a neat part of the physiology of a calf. is I give it probably an overload of things at one time, because 4 quarts is a lot, and I get a relatively good sized curd there. But it takes somewhere in the range of 18 hours plus or minus several hours to digest that curd. It is slowly and efficiently digested, which makes it so neat for a calf, because some of her digestive enzymes aren't functioning super well. So if I put a big slug of nutrients into the small intestine of that calf, I could have some problems with that. But it is just slowly and efficiently digested. And if you ever look at any numbers on that, the digestion percent of colostrum, or even whole milk for that range, is somewhere about 99 point something. It's virtually 100%. And the nice thing about that is you feed a calf now, and for the next 12 to 18 hours it's being fed. So there's always a concern about after you feed that first colostrum, some calves aren't willing or don't seem to want to have a second feeding 6 hours later, 8 hours later. And my answer to that is, I don't care, because she's probably getting fed quite well all the way for the next 18 hours or more. So that second feeding isn't nearly as critical as what we might think. But it does give that calf the ability to be fed for basically as you get them on transition milk, or if you're using colostrum for 2 feedings, you're basically having the first 24 hours or 36 hours of life of having this constant flow of high quality protein and high quality fat. If humans only had renin, when babies are born, you'd feed them every 12 hours. And I've got a couple of pictures here. This was just out of a recent journal of dairy science, and I think it's cool, but I'm sure a lot of other people don't get it. But this is just, or don't think it is, this is just some radiographs of curds of colostrum in newborn calves. And it's kind of hard to see in this first one, but they just show all the way into 8 hours, you still got this good-sized curd here in the abomasum of the calf, and that was after a single feeding 8 hours before. And it's going to get digested really well. Now the third part. And this is one that we don't completely understand, but we're getting better and better. But these large antibodies, which are extremely large proteins, are able to be effectively absorbed, or they can actually in some cases go between the cells of the small intestine and can get right into the bloodstream of the calf. And that's the third critical step that allows that calf within 15 minutes of it being born and getting colostrum, of having antibodies circulating in its bloodstream. So now it can get exposed to whatever is in around the barn, and you shouldn't get a sick or problem calf. This system has a lot of unique characteristics to it. As I said, it's not completely well understood, but it's a system that shuts down with time, and it shuts down with these proteins passing through. My analogy that I always use for this is like the small intestine of a calf has holes in it, although I realize it is not holes at all. But you've got this system where these very large proteins can pass through, which we want. As we go with time up to 24 hours, that shuts completely. So if you have a calf, and it's pretty fast to start off with and then tails down, but if you have a calf that's born and it's 8 hours before you get colostrum in it, even if it's got exposed to nothing, its system of absorbing those antibodies has shut down by probably half or maybe more. So that goes down pretty quick with time. The other thing is it's set up so that as large proteins pass through, it shuts down faster. Which, if you think about it, that's the way it should be. That calf should get colostrum with lots of good antibodies. They get absorbed quick, you shut it down, and then the other large proteins that she's exposed to, like bacteria, won't cross there. And unfortunately, that system isn't specific for antibodies. And there's been some classic research done probably 80 years ago now where they fed calves colostrum and then 20 minutes later can take a blood sample of that calf and you can find the same antibodies, the same IgGs in that colostrum that are now in the blood. And they had in that study, I've got a copy of it up on the web, they fed a mixture of cow manure and water to that calf. Not something we'd like to see, but 20 minutes later they found the same bacteria that were in the cow manure in the bloodstream of that calf. The third treatment they had in that study was a mixture. And you know what they found in the bloodstream of that calf 20 minutes later? Somebody? Ooh, you're too quiet here. A mixture. So think about that when you feed something that you understand is dirty colostrum to a calf. Whatever you're feeding it in that first feeding, those large proteins that are in there, whether they're E. coli's or whether they're IgGs, are going to get in the bloodstream. Now, if you get a few E. coli's in there and they're followed or they are accompanied with the right IgGs, no problem maybe. But then you start a competition there of which is which. And so a key thing that I'm going to talk about is this whole issue of bacteria in colostrum. And by the way, if you have questions, you guys are quieter than yesterday's group. Yesterday's group was maybe too noisy, I don't know. So traditionally we say blood IgGs depend on timing of colostrum. And so I'll adamantly tell you 1 hour. If you, in a perfect world, an hour after that calf is born, you've got colostrum in it. And I realize, and I always have to put this stipulation in for our farms, because our average herd size in Pennsylvania is slightly less than 80 cows. We're 79 point something. We got a lot of 40 cow farms, a lot of 60 cow farms, and those people are not in the barn 24 hours a day, and I wouldn't expect them to. So some calves are going to be born at 3 o'clock in the morning. And if we don't have somebody in there, it's a problem, but we want to get that in there within an hour if at all possible. You can often tell the difference on calves that were fed colostrum late. The quantity of colostrum, which I've said is 4 quarts, and that's just a straightforward, and I'll show you, you can't get too much good colostrum in a calf, but you sure can get not enough. So 4 quarts across the board is the best recommendation ever. And the third one is the quality. And quality is now measured on 2 things. One is a level of immunity in there, and the other is the bacteria. The problem from your standpoint, and the same if I were sitting there and not up here, is that I know I can't measure IgGs at home. It takes us 24 hours in a lab to measure actual IgG levels in a colostrum sample. And it takes me 24 hours at a minimum that I can figure out bacteria levels in there. I guess I could do a few less than that, but it basically takes a day. It's not something that you can get that colostrum sample and turn it around and within an hour know if that's a good quality. But we have to do the best we can with it, and we'll go through that. I will say, and I'll show you some information that I consider both of those to be very important. And the second one is one that a lot of people haven't thought about as much as they have the first. We've had Brix refractometers and colostrometers around for a long time. We haven't thought about the bacteria levels. And the actual, what I consider the pivotal study to show that this is a big one was only published 3 years ago. So it's not been around. We've pretty well assumed that's the problem for a long time, but it hasn't always been known for sure. Now this is what we want to get at in our calf. This is looking at the blood level of immunity in the calves, the blood level of these IgGs that are in your calves over time. And they start off at 0. And we get this first 8-hour time period where we can get that real big peak. Now it may go on a little bit longer than that, but it's that first few hours of life where we get a good efficiency of absorption of those immunoglobulins in the calf. And that's when we can get that peak from colostrum. And then, like all other living cells in a living body, they're constantly dying off. And some of these have a half-life, which means half of them are gone within 3 to 5 days. Other ones will last 21, 28 days. But they drop off pretty fast. And then the calf's own ability to make antibodies takes a while for that to get started. It's really like 6 weeks before it's functioning much at all, and it's really a month beyond that before it does well. So we've definitely got a time period in here when you got a high risk of that calf getting sick or dying. And I always tell a farmer, if you're having calves getting sick or dying, first thing I ask is what age? And quite often, if it happens somewhere between around 2 weeks of age to 3 weeks of age in that time period, it may very well be a disease-related thing, or it could be a parasite, but a very other important part might be the colostrum management. You're not getting that level high enough. And like the way the immunity works is you've got a level of exposure and a level of immunity. And if your management is perfect, you could actually have a low level of colostrum immunity and those calves wouldn't get sick. But as the stress of environment and all the other things that we have to deal with gets higher and higher, it means we have to get that level of immunity in the calf higher and higher to keep it so that immunity is above stress. Once it gets the other direction, you got a sick calf. The other reason I put this in, that there's probably some of you that might be measuring, or your veterinarian is measuring blood samples to look at total protein. Does anyone do that here? Okay. The key thing that you need to remember on there is in a theoretical world, I want that 24 to 48 hours only. But a lot of people, because of convenience and when the vet's coming or when you're taking those blood samples, you may do it only once a week or whatever. Once you get beyond about 48 hours, this is dropping off. And so sometimes you're underestimating what the level of IgGs are in those calves. So I won't tell you not to do that, but I'll tell you to put less emphasis if you've got a calf that has a lower level of blood total protein at 1 week of age, and you say, oh, that's a problem calf. Be a little bit considerate of the fact that it has dropped down naturally. So the ones that when I do a research project on it, it's 24 to 48 hours only, so I can get that peak. And then in terms of efficiency of absorption, that's the thing. Sorry about that yellow isn't showing up here well. But unfortunately, if I give a calf 10 grams of IgGs in that colostrum, it doesn't absorb more than 3 or 4 at the very most. Once in a while, you'll find a 50%, but that's unusual. Lots of times, it's 30% or less. And a typical one maximum would be somewhere around 35%, which means if all the rest of those antibodies, you're putting all that whey going through the small intestine, and not 100% of them are going to get to the outside the cells there where it can get absorbed. But the absorption, because of it going down, and that's what this is kind of showing over time, by 6 hours it's half. If you were to feed a second milking of colostrum, your efficiency of absorption would always be lower, because time has gone against you and they've already absorbed that first bunch of antibodies and it's shut down. And that is why, quite frankly, my recommendations probably 10 years ago for our farmers was to feed 2 quarts of good quality colostrum, and between then and the next 6 to 8 hours, feed another 2 quarts. But the bottom line is I will get less efficiency of absorption, so I have changed my recommendations and fully say give them all 4 quarts at once, go for the maximum absorption that you possibly can get, because there is no such a thing as not enough immunity in a calf. You can get too little, but you can never get too much. I think I said that backwards. When you look at the research with colostrum, though, it's just the most important thing for that calf. If you look at calves with low levels of immunity, this is from IgGs, they're always going to be sicker. And just when, unless you had every one of those calves in a disease-free environment, they're always going to have more issues with being sick. They're always going to have more issues with a higher mortality rate. And it's one of those cascading things with a calf is you give me a sick calf, and we all know that that calf is going to grow less because it's spending more energy trying to fight off disease, and or it's not doing nearly as good a job. If it scours, it's not doing as good a job digesting what you feed it. So they grow slower, they get weaned later, and there's studies that take that all the way into first lactation. It gets a little sketchy by the time you get all the way out there, but there is some really good data showing that colostrum-deprived calves are the ones that get culled earlier in lactation. And that's because they were sick. You have a calf that has chronic pneumonia for 6 weeks, and she's going to have enough lung damage that she's not going to be one that'll take the stress of calving very well. And just the immediate things is this one, which was a study that I did in my first sabbatic when I worked with the National Animal Health Monitoring System, and we had blood IgG data from 24 to 48 hours on Holstein heifer calves from almost 1,800 dairy farms in the U.S. And then we had survivability of those calves. And so you just take that one number of IgGs at 24 hours, and I can separate that out. Back in that point in time, there was a guy at the University of Florida by the name of Art Donovan who had this extension recommendation of 10 grams per liter of IgGs, and that still holds very well. And the data fit about 40-some% of the heifers were down here, and the other 60% was there, which was not good. But just separating the calf mortality up to weaning, in that if I had a high level of IgGs in the blood, which you and I can indirectly and quite well measure by blood total protein, they had about a 96% chance of survivability, or 4% died. If you just look at the group and all the other things involved in calf nutrition and management that was going on in those farms, and separate it out by those that had less than 10, the mortality rate was double. And if we go visit a farm that has a 4% mortality versus an 8% mortality, I'll bet this one's got 3 times as many sick calves also. So you're adding that into it also. This is just the easy one of looking at a dead calf. But this one thing is probably the biggest management thing that you can analyze and try to improve if you're not already doing it, that's going to help your calf mortality. And then, as I said, heifers that have low IgGs get a higher chance of pneumonia and diarrhea, and it just goes on and on and on, and basically it's costing a lot of money. This is just some data from the most recent NOM study, where they only had about 100 farms in this, but they had a lot more data from them. And just looking at that serum IgGs, if it's in this low category, which unfortunately was about 15% of the calves, I think, 45% of the calves are sick, and in this small study, about 7% died. You go to where the average, most people can get it between 10 and 24, because we call this failure of antibody transfer. This is adequate, and we get less sick calves and less dead calves. And then it's actually an amazing number of calves that people really work at, and you can get serum IgGs over 25, which I would have thought 10 years ago would be the real odd and unusual one. But more and more people are getting there, and it just shows that you can't get enough immunity in the calves because these numbers keep going down. We want more and more. So to me, These are the key factors. As I already said, 1 to 2 hours max to get colostrum in. The quality thing, this is one that's really critical. If you aren't using one of these two things, you need to. Now, if you want to be fancy and get an electronic version of this, you can, but it just costs $200 more, and it doesn't tell you a whole lot, anything more, really. This is a colostrometer, pretty common thing. They've been around for 40, 50 years. They break real easy, unfortunately, but they're pretty cheap. And what it's doing, it's measuring the density of that colostrum. And the correlation is reasonably good between density and IgG level. It's not perfect. This is a refractometer that measures sugar, or you look at the category in there called bricks. It's common if you make wine, maple syrup, candy, those kind of things. It's the same thing. You're measuring sugar, and there's a pretty good correlation. It's about the same, really, in terms of correlation of total sugar in there and IgGs. In both cases, I always use the analogy, they're not perfect. And don't try to sell yourself on that electronic one that gives you a number. It's no better. They're good. They let you know what's good and what's bad, but they don't necessarily, if you get a number on there that says 55, you're not really sure if that's 65 or 45, but it's somewhere in there. But it does tell me that if I have a colostrum sample like this, that on a colostrometer it'd be up around 100. I don't care if it's 90 or if it's 110. It's a good quality colostrum. If it's so poor that it sinks down into the red, I don't care if it says 40 or if it says 30. I'm not going to use it either way. So it's great as an indicator for that. And for that reason, I would say when it's in the yellow, don't do like my travelers have been this week, or my drivers the last 2 days. And when they saw a yellow light, I did note it was always step on the gas and not the brake. I want you to step on the brake. If it's in the yellow, don't use it. Yellow and red to me are the same. Oh, he missed that. I'm sorry about that. I'll tell you that one later. Okay. I consider this one of those two tools as an absolute. If you're raising calves, measure colostrum. This is 2018, and we are living in a world where we have genetically selected cows for poor quality colostrum. We've done that since World War II. We have genetically selected for poor quality colostrum. If you don't want to buy one of those two things and use it, and I consider that my number one thing for raising calves, there is an alternative. And the alternative is to breed all of your Holsteins to Angus and start milking them, the cross. You will have, those Angus cows out there have amazing colostrum. The quality of a beef colostrum is just phenomenal. But our dairy cows, we have bred for high milk production, and we've bred them to turn on milk production really soon after calving. And they take that colostrum that they have that's really good stuff, but it's a small amount, and they start diluting it out real fast. And so 4 hours after she calves, colostrum quality is going to be down just because it's diluted, not because she doesn't have the ability to produce it. And so when you start using one of these, very often, at least our farmers will tell me the biggest problem I'll get someone saying, hey, I'm using this colostrometer or this refractometer, and I keep finding, 40, 50% of my colostrum isn't good enough. What's wrong with what's going wrong? My first question always is, how soon after calving are you milking that cow? And sometimes I'll ask, where are you milking that cow? If it's in the parlor, I know the answer. Then I'll ask, do you milk 3 times a day or twice a day? Is it first collected at 12 hours after the calf is born, or 8 hours? Because that's what's happened with that colostrum. It's gotten diluted out. So, there is no such, if you think you have a problem metabolically with your cows or the dry cow program and you're not getting colostrum, no. It's there, you're just not seeing it, you're not collecting it at the right time. Now the next big problem with this whole absorption of large proteins, as I talked about, this is a shot that someone took, and I guess I have to believe their information on this, but it's E. coli being passed across through the gut wall. There's a relatively small area that it has to pass through, and it's pH dependent, and we know a whole lot about that. But these cells can latch onto IgGs, or they can latch onto bacteria, and they can pull them right through. So there is a direct reason why calves that aren't fed good quality colostrum are going to get less IgGs. And there are lots of things in our colostrum management procedures and steps that can get bacteria in there, whether it's a maternity pen management, calving management, but a lot of it is the newborn calf feeding system often. And there are bacteria in there. A few years ago I did this study in Pennsylvania where I gave dairy farmers, we went out to visit them and gave them a small bottle and said and explained to them what we were doing, and then the next time you have a Holstein heifer calf that you're feeding colostrum to, put some of it in here, stick it in the refrigerator, and give us a call, and we'll come out and get it. They knew we were analyzing a whole bunch of stuff in it. So in that case, if I tell you I'm analyzing bacteria and IgGs in there, and you have a cow that calves and things didn't work out quite right, and this wasn't right and that wasn't right, are you going to collect a sample and give me a call? No, you're going to wait till the next one. I know that. I mean, that's human nature. I would do the same. So I think if anything, I have a biased sample towards better quality colostrum. And this is looking at, I'll just look at the one thing here of coliform count, which is the kind of green color here. I got 10% of the samples here, or 15% of the samples had 0 coliforms. And by the way, if I have coliforms in milk or colostrum in this case, are they secreted from the mammary gland? Where do those coliforms come from that are in that colostrum? Pardon? To be a little more, it's probably manure. To be a little more blunt, yeah. You're being nice. Yeah, this is manure contamination. And I've got another 15% that had less than 100. Your bulb is getting bad. But I come over up here on this end, and I've got a little over 10%, I forget what the number of, 11 something, that had over 10 million. Well, now, is that colostrum or is that bacteria soup? That had to be, that was flat out dirty colostrum to be like that. And so that was one of the things that we've made a big push in Pennsylvania, because we had a lot of people that weren't doing a good job on colostrum management. And there's a lot of places it could be coming from. It's probably not coming from the milking system if it's a parlor, but it may be from the milking system if it's a secondary unit that you're using in the maternity pen area, which is almost necessary if you're going to get it in time. A lot of it may come from just not cleaning that cow's udder very well. It may be milking equipment, it may be feeding equipment, or something like this one. When I took this picture with this guy, he had his fingers inside that esophageal feeder. Now I realize you and I aren't, we're not living in a sterile environment, but when you work around a barn, or I do, you're going to have all sorts of stuff on your fingers. Even if after you wash them, you're going to have stuff on your fingers. And so, you have to think about all the ways you got to keep it really, really clean. And then you got this one that's not showing up well at all. This is an esophageal feeder, which I can't even see on this. It's on the screen there. But an esophageal feeder can be I've seen some terrible examples where that's dirty. You want one that's relatively clean. You're going to need to toss them out every now and then and get a new one. I have never seen any farmer that can show me a good way to actually scrub out that tube. You can rinse it, but not scrub it out. And some people will use it 1 minute on a sick calf and the next minute on a newborn calf. and you haven't sterilized it in between. Sure, you've rinsed it off, but what kind of things are on that? So be real clean about how you're using that, and just think about, as sterile as possible. And this is the study that we did a couple of years ago, which we took some good quality. This was all the same batch of colostrum. And on a university herd, I can do this terrible thing that I would never let you do of pool colostrum. But we've got a closed herd, and our IACOC tells us it's okay to do this. But I've had to do my homework on it to do this. But I can pool a lot of colostrum, and I can run experiments on all one batch of colostrum. We took that and fed it to some calves, and I can get blood IgG levels of 22 or so, which is it's a real nice level to get it up there. Then I had another batch where we took that same colostrum and left it set out for 12 hours at room temperature. And I have been in dairy farms before where I see a bucket of something that's white on the floor in the milk room or in the calf room, and I'll ask what that is, and I'll get told it's colostrum, which means they plan on feeding it. Well, after it sits out there, bacteria, some people say it doubles every 20 minutes in milk, and I'm not sure, not all of them do, but it goes up pretty fast. And 12 hours, when I now had bacteria and IgGs going in that first feeding for the calf, I got half the level of IgGs transferred. I didn't measure the bacteria, and I can't really do that this way, but it cut the absorption way down. Then I took and I pasteurized some of it. And pasteurized colostrum will very often, not always, but very often give you higher levels of blood IgGs because you've eliminated more and more of the bacteria in there. I mean, this wasn't perfect stuff, it was pretty low, but this was better, and so I actually get higher levels of blood IgGs. But I took that pasteurized colostrum, and remember, pasteurizing is not sterilizing. Pasteurizing just means I brought the level down from where it started. But I left this set out, and legitimately we had to leave it set out a little bit longer. This was more like 24 hours to get about the same level of bacteria as I had over here. And I cut absorption in half. So bacteria absolutely directly interfere with IgG absorption. This is just something that was published a while ago where they took, this is fresh colostrum, this is looking at total bacteria count. Fresh colostrum, and this was pretty clean stuff. Pasteurized colostrum, it better have less in or you didn't pasteurize it. And then they stored it in a refrigerator, a little bit warmer and room temperature. Okay, so they go in that order. The next slide's got the blood levels in there that they found. This is blood IgG levels. Fresh, in this case their pasteurized was a little bit lower, and there could be one or two reasons for that. Fresh, then you got stored, and these two are actually the same numerically. They're different, but statistically they're the same. But as you stored it more and more and warmer, they get the same effect. Bacteria interferes with IgG absorption. So once again, this is where what I want you to be doing. You got to have one of these. And yes, sure.
You're showing that pasteurized colostrum actually has less absorption.
Yeah, you'll have that for two reasons. Potentially, there's probably a third and fourth that don't know about. But one is if you give me a really high quality colostrum, you get a colostrum that it's, well, let me go back to a colostrometer on that. It's a 90 or 100 or more on a colostrometer. When I heat colostrum, pasteurize it, I'm always killing off some IgGs. Your actual IgG level is always going to be slightly lower. The other thing is that lots of times people will pasteurize it at the right temperature, but they'll pasteurize it for an hour, and the longer you pasteurize it, the more those IgGs get knocked off. If you've got average quality colostrum, though, the trade-off of getting rid of the bacteria will always give you an increase in serum IgGs. But if you've got super IgGs to start with, it'll actually drop it.
So, Judge, in the one that they store it for 48 hours in
Whoops, sorry.
the refrigerator, is that because the bacterial contamination is interfering with IgG absorption, or is because it's destroying the IgG because maybe degrading some of the protein cost?
Don't know about the degrading protein. Potentially that's there, but I think more of it is bacteria grow in a refrigerator. And I will tell you, if you collect colostrum and you put it in a refrigerator, and lots of farms will do it, maximum 24 hours. Sheila McGurk from Wisconsin's got some neat data that she's collected over the years, and it's just 24 hours. I think she won't even go more than 12 hours stored in the refrigerator, because it's not frozen. Oftentimes it's in at least a bottle that has some, it's not real thin, so it's going to be several hours after you put it in the refrigerator before the stuff in the center of even a bottle is going to be cool enough, so it's going to grow some bacteria. Now, this is the one that I throw out as a challenge. And I don't want to ask if anyone's not using one of these, but if you're not using one of these or the electronic version, I can almost guarantee you that you will reduce your mortality by a little bit, maybe 1%, maybe more. If your mortality is already at 1%, you probably won't, but you can probably reduce your mortality and morbidity by using one of these, because you're going to find that 5 to 20% of the colostrum samples on your herd, if it's more than 20, you got a problem, but don't meet the standard that you want to feed once you're using this. And you're going to take those 5 or 10% out of the system, and you're going to feed them as second milking or feed them to something that it doesn't make a difference. And those calves are going to get good quality stuff. They're going to get higher levels of immunity, and they're going to be healthier. And there's no question that this is a management tool that's going to save you money, save you time, save you drugs, save you all sorts of things. And then the second thing that you're going to find that you do is that you're going to start culling good quality colostrum, because it's human nature. When you start measuring this, you're going to try to do better, and that's what we should do. And what you're going to find is that all of a sudden you're not going to be taking colostrum that just passes the minimum. You're going to be looking for higher. And I've seen farmers that, I remember one time being in a barn, and this lady was throwing colostrum away that on her colostrometer was a 90, which is really good stuff. And I said, what are you doing with that? Why aren't you feeding that? And she said, no, I just got some a couple hours ago that was 110. I'm going to use that. And so you will push your level of immunity up in calves, which is only going to be beneficial. And it's using a tool in human nature that works really well. So the factors that affect concentration of colostrum being bacteria, we summarized our data and some of the data from Sandra Godden for a number of years, and we've both done a lot of work on pasteurizing colostrum. High bacteria versus low bacteria colostrum, that's what you get for blood IgGs, which is the thing that some people, does anyone here measure blood IgGs? Okay, I mean that's the end result. That's the I can publish data on those blood serum proteins or blood IgGs. It's good information, but high bacteria versus low bacteria, it makes a huge impact with the same quality. And in terms of goals for that, and this does come from Dr. Godden, is that you want to have, if you don't know what your bacteria is and you've got no way to plate it at home, which I'm sure some of you can, your vet or your milk co-op will easily take a sample and give you bacteria and coliform counts. You want bacteria to be relatively low, less than 100,000. Dr. McGurk says less than 10,000 coliforms. I would like to see that less than 1,000, because I don't want to drink it if I know it has 10,000 coliforms in it. But she's just basing that off of, and she's very right of, you can stand a little bit in there, and that isn't going to be the end of the earth. And we aren't milking, we aren't getting sterile milk all the time in colostrum. That's just reality. Now, pasteurization, that's the next step. If you find that your system and you're having questions about it, and you know, you may look into pasteurizing it. I'm not saying you have to, but we basically reduce the bacteria in there. We're not sterilizing it, but if you think bacteria is going to be a problem, and it very well may be in your operations, especially in the summertime or whenever it's warm, which I guess is 10 months or 11 months out of the year here. I wish we had that, but there are lots of systems out there. This is a small one that can be used for 1 or 2 cows, or basically 1 cow's colostrum. You can do it, or they've got all sorts of large systems that are really, really cool. They're all about the same. They've got a square box that you pasteurize. You put your colostrum in a bag that will hold anywhere. You can get them for 2 quart, 3 quart, or 4 quart. I see no reason, unless you want to use 2 bags, not to use a 4 quart bag. But you put it in there, you put a cap on it, put it in here, push a button, and it pasteurizes. Then you put it in the freezer or use it fresh, and you can thaw them out in the same system. They're really great. They come with a nipple that fits on here, or an esophageal feeder that fits on there. Once you have it pasteurized, you can have really dirty hands, and it isn't going to make a difference. They can be some neat systems. So my summary, colostrum is invaluable for that calf for all the reasons in terms of health and growth. Calves have a limited immune system at birth, and we have to help them out a whole lot. And to me, the colostrum management has to focus on getting good quality in there, which is low bacteria and high IgGs within the first 2 hours of life. A key one, which is actually more newer data, legitimately, is that we now know bacteria directly interferes with IgG absorption, and it's an important thing. We got to keep the colostrum bacteria numbers down. We've got to keep our system for getting colostrum clean, sanitize those buckets, you know, do everything that you would do if you were going to be selling that milk. You want it as clean as saleable milk, and you may or may not need to pasteurize. I don't, you know, pasteurizing is something that some farms want to do, but it's not something I would ever recommend everyone doing. There's a lot of other things that you can do before you might pasteurize. So any questions on that? Yes?
What if you have like a Jersey calf? Can't really shove 4 quarts in the herd.
No, yeah, and I usually say that, but they didn't tell me I had, yeah, okay. Yeah, a Jersey, if you get 3 quarts in, you're going to be doing good.
Is it okay to feed her?
And there's nothing, yeah.
2 quarts,
there.
like the first, you know, and then maybe a couple hours later feed her a couple quarts, or does that not be enough room?
No, you still don't have enough room. And really what we're after is we're looking at the IgGs in the plasma. And the volume of plasma that a Jersey calf has is smaller than a Holstein. And there's, you know, but it's getting the same levels of IgGs. So if you take a blood sample, if you've got good quality colostrum, 2 quarts can easily give you those same, you know, high levels of IgGs. Yeah, I usually make that comment about, you know, it's going to be, but you're used to that after a bunch of years. Same might hold true in some crossbreeding programs. If you've got crossbreds that you know, for whatever reason are smaller calves, you have to be realistic about how much you put in them. Anyone else? Okay. I'll cover a few more things related. Well, this one I already almost covered, but you know, you may be measuring blood total proteins. I really encourage you, if you're having questions about whether your calves are getting sick or you're having mortality problems in the calves, get your vet to help you get started on this. It's not a hard thing to do. Getting a blood sample from a calf is about the easiest thing in the world, except a Jersey calf at birth. That was when I started grad school, that was my first project, getting blood samples from newborn Jersey calves, and they have really tiny veins. at that age. But it's a great way to check your system. And so get your vet to take some blood samples and measure total protein. He uses a refractometer. It's simple. 1 drop of serum on a refractometer, and you get a very accurate value of, is your colostrum management working? If it's not, I can't tell you, and he or she can't either, exactly why without asking a lot of questions, and then you have some good possible answers, but you can tell you're not doing something right. Now to get on to liquid feeding calves, which is really the only other thing I'm going to try to cover, there are lots of different ways to feed calves once you get that first feeding. They all have some stipulations in them. Milk replacer, if all else fails, reads the directions and follow the directions. And about an hour ago I had to tell somebody that. If all else fails, reads the direction. I know my wife always tells me that I'm not one that always does that, but I'll tell you, you have to do it. Milk is best as is. It doesn't need diluting. Once in a while I'll find someone with that. And the third one, waste milk or saleable milk. Anything that's not pasteurized. What I always tell a farmer, let me see who to pick on. I can pick on you because is I want you to be this far away from your veterinarian or closer and look he or she right in the eyes and say, are you comfortable with me not pasteurizing my milk from my herd? If they say, fine, you're a closed herd, you've got a really low level of disease, I'm comfortable with it, then go for it. Otherwise, pasteurize it. The cost of pasteurizer, most farms will pay for a pasteurizer, and I don't want to give you a number, but it's usually far less than a year. And they're really relatively cheap when you look at the investment and the outcome from it. So it's one I always encourage people to do. It eliminates a lot of diseases that we might be concerned about passing on to the next generation. When you're feeding milk replacer, and this is one that I know lots of people, there's about 20% of the dairy calves in the U.S. still get fed milk replacers. Used to be a whole lot more, but we got to feed more than we traditionally were. Traditionally, we fed a pound of milk replacer per day. And calves have a maintenance requirement and a growth requirement, and when you have a 100-pound calf and it takes this much energy from a 2020 milk replacer to satisfy her maintenance requirement, she's only got that much left for growth, and she's not going to grow very fast, which is not a good idea in this day and age. So you need somewhere a minimum of 1.25 pounds to 1.33 pounds. And we have to get there. And almost all, I have not seen a tag in the U.S. that hasn't had that as a recommendation. So if you read the directions, you'd be doing it. Along with that, though, how we house our calves can have a big impact on that maintenance requirement. And we have a lot of trouble up in our part of the world with temperature and wind speed. And it takes more energy in the wintertime for our calves that are outside or maybe even inside to maintain their body temperature. And when they're taking more energy to maintain their body temperature, they are going to grow slower. In your situation, you've got heat stress, which in some situations might be even worse. They have to cool themselves. And unfortunately, heat stress calves have the other caveat that they may not feel like eating grain. There's good data to show that when I've got my cold stress calves and they're 2 weeks of age or they are at the point of eating grain, they'll actually increase their grain intake as it gets colder. So lots of times they make up for it by grain intake, but they still need more energy one way or another. So keep in mind that under some situations, those young calves may need to get fed a little more milk or milk replacer to get the same growth rates that you want to have. Maybe not every season of the year, but some seasons of the year. In terms of what's happening with those calves as you feed them, there's some neat things with calves are neat when they're monogastric. From getting this is looking at average daily gain in pounds versus how much of a 2020 milk replacer. 85% of the milk replacer, so I was told 2 weeks ago, in the U.S. is a 2020. And I was having this argument because I'd like to see it a little higher in protein and maybe a little lower in fat, but 85% of the market is 20/20 milk replacer. So I always do my math on that. But the neat thing about milk feeding or milk replacer feeding is it's a straight line. The more milk you feed that calf, the faster she grows. But there's a trade-off there from a standpoint of unless I'm eating a veal calf or unless I'm showing a calf, and that blue ribbon makes a big difference to me, there is a fine line there of how much you need to feed. But if you get somewhere around that 1.25 pound milk replacer, this is looking again at average daily gain here, and if I get somewhere between 3/4 and a pound of average daily gain only from the milk in a calf, I'm pretty happy with that. And so when you do the math on that, that works out to about 1.25 pounds to 1.33 pounds of milk replacer, and it needs to be about 20% protein, so it isn't too far off. If you want to get high rates of growth, and I took this out to 2 pounds a day, then you got to get up to a 26, 27, 28% protein replacer. But if I'm feeding calves for a relatively normal growth rate the first 2 weeks of life, you don't need that super high protein. It's just, and in this day and age, it's going to cost you a lot of money if you're feeding milk replacer. If you're feeding milk, it might be a little different. On a dry matter basis, what's the protein content of your milk?
30.
About 30, yeah. So that's one of the reasons why milk-fed calves will usually, they're about 30% fat, plus or minus a little, and 30% protein. So you're giving them a big slug of nutrients there, and more than this, but you know, they don't necessarily need all that extra protein. In terms of protein sources, it's one to be concerned about is we know the young calf, especially the first 2 weeks of life, digest and absorb the proteins from milk best because it's designed to break those down. If I have vegetable proteins in there, whether it be soy, wheat, or whether it's egg or serum, those are all great quality proteins in a milk replacer, but they don't get digested real well until that calf is 2 or more weeks of age. So the first couple weeks they aren't going to digest them that well. They may end up with some nutritional scours. It's not the end of the earth. And in terms of decision by you, you may say, hey, if I can use a wheat protein or a plasma protein in my milk replacer, it's cutting my costs down. I'm going to get a little bit of growth difference, but you know, it becomes a trade-off. And I'm not saying it's right or wrong. It has to be your decision.
So Jud, just a quick question.
Yes.
You made a comment that 80% of the milk replacers sold in the U.S. is 20% protein, 20%.
Yeah, it's been that way for years. I asked that question the other day because I was hoping it would have changed, and it hasn't.
But you said that you would like to see lower fat. Is that because it's suppressed, because satiety and suppressed grain?
Yeah, yeah.
But if you were to feed whole milk, I would feed something that has
It's higher fat.
30% fat and 25%
Yeah.
protein on a dry matter basis.
Yeah, so I can suppress grain intake a little bit with that, especially if I feed too high a level. Yeah. Milk is probably a little bit extra fat in there.
At what fat content in the replacer you're going to have less fat on?
In a perfect world, I'd like that replacer to be like 16% fat. Even a 15 or 14 I can live with sometimes of the year.
And more of the calories to come from protein.
Yeah. But that's taken an animal. If you've got heat stress or if I've got some other environmental stress, that's why the 20 has probably been the norm because I'm erring in the side of supplying some extra energy for that calf. Because I know, the average calf does have some environmental stress part of the year. So next point is how many times do you feed? And this is just one that that has been bugging me the last few years. I was on a farm in PA a while ago where this lady was absolutely tired, and she said she just don't know how long she can keep this up. Her calves were looking good, and she'd been convinced to feed them 3 times a day, and it was just killing her. And I had to explain to her, as I will to you, that there is absolutely no data anywhere that I'm aware of, at least that's been published, that shows that 3 times a day or 4 times a day is better than twice a day. There just isn't. Feed your calves twice a day and they're just fine. This is just a study that was in the Journal of Dairy Science, shows that. I mean, that spacing out those feedings is just not necessary unless you're feeding super high rates of milk replacer. Then you've got a limit as to how much that young calf is going to eat. The other one that always intrigues me, and I'm not telling you to do this, but I'm telling you it is done, is that there are a certain group of farms in the world, and in some places it's pretty common. Go over to France and they all do it, or not all, a lot of them do it, feed once a day. And there's been studies done for years and years showing if you feed a calf once a day, and it has to be milk, it has to be something that forms a curd in the abomasum, so you get digestion throughout the day. If you feed them the same amount once a day versus twice a day, no difference in anything. So my conclusion for you, and some of this depends on what you're feeding, but you can feed a calf once a day, twice a day, 3 times a day, or 4 times a day, and if you keep them healthy, they all turn into heifers. That's all there is to it. And it just depends on your management. This study I like to use because this is done in an experiment station in northern Minnesota, and they fed those calves once a day. It was fed milk, but it can be done. If you do it, there's a few caveats I would want to tell you. I never want to tell someone that you go try once a day blindly. You have to think about it and adjust your management, because if you only look at that calf once a day, a calf can die pretty quick. But basically, if I would ask you all your calf raising systems, every one of you would have a different system, and if your mortality rate's low and morbidity rate's low, they're all perfect. Lots of ways to get it to work. I do tell you, though, you really need to think about cost, and this changes over time. I did this for some producers in Pennsylvania, and I apologize for some of you for my 20 calves. You can add some zeros onto that if you want. But just comparing the cost of milk replacer, different systems, and these were actual costs. I mean, we called up and got a couple companies to give us the prices for a standard 2020 all the way up to a 2620 for an accelerated feeding system, and just compared that to waste milk and compared it, unfortunately, to the cost of what saleable milk is in Pennsylvania today. And across the board, I can feed waste milk or saleable milk, and I did these at the same categories that would give me theoretically the same growth rates as that milk replacer, and that shows you the comparison. So that tells you also why a high percentage of dairy farms in the U.S. in the last 5 years have gone from that system to this system, and it has to do with economics and whether or not they grow. But I put in this, the reason why this isn't lower than that is there is a cost of a pasteurizer in there, and I highly, if you were to make that switch, I'd highly say go to a pasteurizer. I don't remember the last time, if ever, I was on a farm that had a pasteurizer that they weren't using it. Unless it's, get one and use it, and it's an easy decision. Now, a last thing about how much I feed them. I am running over here, I'm sure, I'm sorry. This is just one of a dozen different studies that have been published around the world over many years. But it's a good example of, or it's the one I use. This is calves that were fed a 2020 milk replacer compared to calves that were allowed to suckle their dams. They were Holstein cows. Now, not a good way to sell milk if you allow the calves to suckle their dams for 6 weeks. Besides that, after 6 weeks, you put that cow in the parlor and she's not letting down her milk. I can guarantee that. But they just compared average daily gain on those two systems. So this is high levels of milk with high fat and high protein. You can't argue that there's nutrient excess there without a doubt, compared to milk replacer. And at weaning, you got that picture. Assuming those two baby calves, or those two calves at birth were the same body size, as a dairy farmer that wants to calve heifers at 22 to 23 months, which one do you want? Who wants the one on the left? Now, I said you're a dairy farmer milking that wants to calve heifers at 22 to 23 months. I didn't say you were raising veal calves. Which one, who wants the one on the left? Can I hold you? Oh, I got one to say, yeah, all right, yes, you're right. I won't ask how many want the one on the right because you're wrong. If you look at the rest of the data, and this always happens, the first study I ever published at Penn State was on cold ad lib acidified milk replacer feeding. And that was 30-some years ago. And we had the same thing. What happens is you look at the average daily gain up to 12 weeks. Take it out a little farther than just weaning. And the control is always better than the treatment in this case. The low level of milk is better. And even if they're equal, which one costs you more money? Okay? What you're doing there, that after you get colostrum into the calf, the next most important thing to me is rumen development. The calf's born with a rumen that is really small. It doesn't do anything. Doesn't have too much bacteria at all in it. Doesn't digest fiber at all, but that's what she's going to live most of her life using. The abomasum is going to digest milk, but that rumen's going to digest forage, and it's going to make acetic and propionic acid, which are really efficient energy sources for that calf, for that heifer, and for that cow. You know, if you think about that, that cow can produce her body weight. The real top ones can produce their body weight in milk protein every year, and their body weight in milk fat every year. The only other species that can do that of mammals that can do that's the chicken, and she can only do it once. The cow can do it year after year, and it has to do with that rumen. When you feed her starch, which is calf grain, calf starter, she makes butyric acid. And the ruminant animal has the ability to not absorb butyric acid in the bloodstream. Acetic and propionic get absorbed and they get converted into energy real fast in the liver. Butyric acid has a different method of changing that into energy, and it happens within the cells of the rumen wall. So when a baby calf, when I feed a calf starch and it gets digested and gets butyrate as an end product, the rumen has first dibs on the energy that's made from that butyric acid. Now, all the beef calves running around the countryside here that don't get grain, I understand that, although they do get sugar in their forage, but they will get rumen development, but they're not going to get it as fast as you and I want it, because I want to look at economics, and I can't feed milk all the time. A good time for a quiz question. Now, you got to answer this, all right? Can't be quiet. Of all the dairy replacements on your farm, which group is the most expensive per animal per day? Which group?
Milk-fed calves.
Milk-fed calves, thank you. Which group is the very least expensive?
Forage-fed calves.
Yeah, but which group? Actually, some of those forage ones eat a lot. It's the first group after weaning.
Oh.
Anytime you do an analysis, and I've done dozens of them on farms, it's always milk-fed calves are here, the first group after weaning is here, and you know what? It's your decision, your management decision when you go from there to there. And why do we have like 10% of the calves in the U.S. are weaned after 10 weeks of age? Those are if you're weaning after 10 weeks of age, I'm sorry, I just want to come out and say, you know, what are you thinking? Why are you doing this? There's no reason to do that. It's economics. But this whole idea of getting the rumen development, these are pictures of calves that were fed all milk. And in some of these cases, these were huge calves, because I do some on real fast growth rates, and huge calves on the outside, but the inside they had a rumen that looked like this, and these were calves that had grain. And it's completely different. Unfortunately, you and I can't see it otherwise, but I'm growing these papillae in the rumen that weren't there to start with, but they're what makes a cow a cow. They allow her to digest everything that's produced by the bacteria in the rumen and get absorbed real quick. And the key thing, butyric acid grows that rumen wall and the rumen, and it takes 21 to 28 days of a calf eating that much. So one of the biggest things I see people doing wrong today are feeding adequate to high levels of milk, and they don't change their weaning to get grain intake up. And they use the old axiom that we have of have that calf eating 2 pounds of grain for 3 days and it's time to wean her. But it takes 21 to 28 days to grow the rumen, and you can't do it with a high level of milk feeding and back off for a week. You got another 2 weeks to go. So it's got to get some grain in it to a longer period of time. Follow the growth. If you have your calves on milk and you wean them, they should go like this in terms of growth rate. If they go like this or once in a while like this, like they did in that slide that I had, then you didn't have good rumen development. It's the key thing. The second thing after colostrum is rumen development. And this is the other one that fits into that picture. This is a summary of a whole lot of data, but if you look at the dry matter intake of calves, and this is from published data, if I'm feeding a low level of milk, I get a high level of grain. When I feed a calf high levels of milk, they don't eat much grain. They've got a limit in terms of what their dry matter and energy intake is, and you can't get around that. And based on a lot of data, that's where I come up with my recommendations of 6-7 quarts is good. You get up to 8 quarts of whatever you're feeding a day, and you go off the deep end in terms of allowing that calf to eat grain. So I think that's about, yeah, I get into rumen development stuff since I've done it for lots of years.
I have a question.
Yes.
So back up to, you were saying about beef calves that were suckling their mamas and then they didn't, and they were on grass or whatever, forage diet, and their rumen doesn't develop as quickly as the ones that are on grain-fed?
Right, yeah, because they're not getting that extra starch. But they're getting sugar in the grass, and sooner or later, they do get a perfectly well-developed rumen. It just takes longer than what you and I are willing to put up with in that calf.
So starch is what really pushes the rumen?
Yeah, starch and sugar will do it too. Yeah. But if I told you had to wait and wean your calves to 6 months of age, you'd told me to get in the car and go back up the road. Yeah. In terms of whether you feed forage or not, depends on your starter. If your calf starter has some particle size in it, and from the research that we've done, a calf has an effective fiber requirement of about 4 millimeters. And that's a piece of oats or a piece of corn. It doesn't take a whole lot. So if you've got some forage, if you've got some particle size in there, you don't need a forage. If you've got a finely ground, if you've got a small pellet that they had to grind it fine, nutritionally it may be great. I realize half the calf starters in the U.S. are that way. They're fine, but you may run into a point, especially close to weaning, where they need something in the rumen of fiber. Calves have the innate ability, they want to chew their cud. They'll chew their cud by 7 days of age. If you've got a calf starter with some particle size, they'll do it on that. Otherwise, you give them something. So I'll end up with this one. My bottom line on the second thing that you want to do with the calf is I want that calf to develop a rumen. And if she's fed milk and forage, it's going to look like that. And if she's fed milk, it's going to look like that. And keep in mind that if you've got a well-developed rumen, she's making rumen microbial protein in there, which is about 50% plus or minus crude protein. Has a very high biological value, which means it's got the right amino acids that match up to her needs, which is muscle growth. And those bacteria, while they're making bacterial protein, they happen to making acetic, propionic, and butyric acid, which is how a cow makes 110 pounds of milk a day. They're very efficient sources of energy, and they're going to make that calf grow real fast.